today, this very day, whatever's happening in your life, you can be at home with the Heavenly Father, and He really does love you. And you can do this as you learn the secret of the easy yoke from Jesus. How to effortlessly, without constant strain and white knuckling and trying harder and harder and harder, do what Jesus would do if He were in your place, if He were you. And we do this by arranging our lives around those practices, those activities, those rhythms that Jesus Himself engaged in throughout His life so that He could be constantly at home with and receiving power from His Heavenly Father. And if Jesus, who after all was the Son of God, if He required that way of life, then probably we do too. If we trust Him, we must trust that He knew how to live His life. And today, we're going to talk about the practice of worship. And before I forget, it will come around to coffee at the end. So Tim, if I forget coffee, just remind me. I just had that thought. What is worship? Well, we talked last time about studying God. That's something that we do primarily with our minds. Dallas writes, the study of God in His Word and in His works, people, nature, and so, opens the way for the disciplines of worship and celebration. And to separate those two, to engage in study without it leading to worship is to sever our heart from our mind. On the other hand, to try to generate emotive or experiential worship without feeding the mind is to idolatrize experience. To just want to have experience, to worship experience rather than worshiping God. So we combine both of them. In worship, Dallas writes, we engage ourselves with, dwell upon, express the greatness, beauty, and goodness of God through thought and the use of words, rituals, and symbols. We do this alone as well as in union with God's people. To worship is to see God as worthy, to ascribe great worth to Him, worthship. Here, for example, is worship. Now I'll read these words. You can worship right now. You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power. For you have created all things, and for your pleasure they are, and they were created. That's in Revelation chapter 4, verse 11. Or again, worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches, wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing and honor and glory and power be unto Him that sitteth upon the throne and unto the Lamb forever and ever. God, receive our worship right now. Dallas writes, as we worship in this matter, and see, we can go back and forth from a moment of worship into life or whatever we were doing the moment before. As we do that, giving careful attention to the details of God's actions, to His worthiness, then the good we adore enters our minds and hearts to increase our faith and strengthen us so that we can become as He is. Now, sometimes something extraordinary might happen in worship. Talk about this for a moment. If in worship we're met by God Himself and our thoughts and our words turn to the perception and the experience of God, who is then really present to us in some degree in His greatness and beauty and goodness. That is what is sometimes called the manifest presence of God. God is always present, but I don't always see Him. I'm not always aware. There are moments of the manifest presence of God that will make an immediate dramatic change in our lives. And this is what happened in Isaiah. There's a great passage you might know in Isaiah chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, interestingly, it was at a time when the circumstances looked bad, when there was the loss of a great leader who brought security and confidence. Precisely at that moment, no accident, he catches a vision of God high and lifted up, seated on the throne. It's the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled. This happens sometimes in worship. Nevertheless, the direct divine encounter is not essential to true worship. And it may also occur outside of the context of purposeful worship. And that happens all the time. People just stumble into God in the Bible when they're not even looking for Him. Okay, so that's what worship is, and it may involve a deep emotional experience. It may well not. Why would we want to engage in worship? And I'll say one reason why we would not. When I was growing up, it often seemed odd to me. Why does God command us to worship him? It sounds kind of like an insecure narcissist who has this need for everybody to stand around telling him how great he is. Well, that is not God. God is not insecure. God does not need anybody to tell him that he's wonderful to prop up his fragile ego. C.S. Lewis writes about this. Rather, when we see something extraordinary, marvelous, that's moving to us, our experience of it is incomplete until we are able to express it to somebody else. And you know what that's like. You got to see this movie. You got to read this book. You got to go to this restaurant. First time I saw Niagara Falls, I was amazed at that sight and the need to have somebody to tell about it. If you can't tell about it, it's really frustrating. Now, if that experience of wonder is something that occurs in the presence of a person, you don't just want to express your awe and admiration to anybody, you want to express it to that person. And that's part of how and why people get married. That's a good thing to know. Like if there's somebody in your life and you're experiencing that deep sense of you are a fabulous human being, I want to tell that person. And then that becomes part of our relationship. And that's the gift that worship gives to us. We are made for worship. You are made for worship. It's a gift from God because it enriches your life. There's a psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, one of the primary leaders in the positive psychology movement. And he noted, we'll often be aware of the opposite of fear is courage, for example, or the opposite of deception is truthfulness. And he wondered, disgust is a prominent part of the human emotional experience. What's the opposite of disgust? And he found it was an experience that he came to call elevation, a sense of awe. He said that we experience awe when we see beauty and strength and goodness, 5 components to it, and a supernatural element to it. It's transcendent, it's beyond me, and a threat, a sense that there is something fearful here if I got on the wrong side of it. And that is awe. And we are meant to have a sense of the transcendent, a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, a sense of mystery. And that is what the gift of worship brings to us. It transforms in us so that life is no longer this routine, humdrum, meaningless thing. Now, how do I actually go about worshiping? Well, one thing that worship is not the same thing as just music. You may love music. I love music myself, and music may be real helpful to you in worship. It's not the whole of worship. Often people think about a worship service just as the music thing. Maybe you're not real into music or real into church music. I have a friend where if we're at a church service and then the worship leader has been real into the music, and at the end of some song he says, man, if that doesn't make your heart beat really fast, you must be dead. And my friend will say, well, then I must be dead because it didn't do a thing for me. Worship is not the same thing as music. It is much larger than that. I find for myself privately also, I have a difficult time sustaining worship if I just try to freelance it. If I just try to say, God, you're so good, you're so wonderful, I run out of words for that pretty quick. And it's kind of the same thing with people. I'll express that to Nancy directly, but it doesn't go on for half an hour. So here's a few things that help me. Lift up your hearts. There's an ancient liturgy that used to be used in the early days of the church where the leader would say, the Lord be with you. And they would say, and also with you. And then the leader would say, lift up your hearts. The Latin phrase for that is sursum corda. And the people say, we will lift them up indeed. And one writer I was reading said, every morning should be a sursum corda. I read that's what that little phrase means. And I love that notion that when the morning comes, the lifting up of the hearts, the use of the body in worship. You know, God has made us so that our minds impact our bodies, but also our bodies impact our minds. And on a regular basis, early in the morning, I will say the Lord's Prayer. I also find that often using a set prayer like the Lord's Prayer, or the morning prayer is used in 12-step groups that starts out, God, direct my thinking so that it's divorced from self-seeking dishonesty, self-pity, self-will, and fear. Inspire my thoughts, decisions, and intuitions. And then I'll think, oh man, to think of God and God loving me, that's inspiring. To raise my hands up just reminds me at the level of my body, I don't have to carry the world on my shoulders. I'm not Atlas, for God's sake. God's got all that. And then my heart gets lifted up to use nature, to use poetry, to use song. When my dad died, he told us not long before he died that he wanted a song called "This Old House" to be played at his funeral. I'd never heard of that song. I listened to it. It was real popular a long time ago. And it's this really kind of odd, funny song. But part of why my dad wanted it sung is so that people would know he had a sense of humor and a sense of joy. And among other things, it's kind of a picture of the fact that my body is this old house. Ain't gonna need this house no longer. Gonna go meet, and I can't hear that song, but think about my dad and those moments together and worship God. Now, that brings me to this. Coffee is a real good thing. Any of the good things that God has can be an occasion for worship. I have a treasured little friend, and we have kind of a liturgy when it comes to making coffee that we will do sometimes. And it involves a series of steps in coffee production. And at the end of it, because it is not just coffee, but it is coffee that has been, in a sense, after a fashion, made by one I love, I need to express joy. And so what I did from that very first time was to take a taste of it and then say, this makes my stomach so happy, I must whomp my belly. And I will not do this right now, but when I am with him, either in person or on FaceTime, I will lift up my shirt and take my hand and whomp my belly, and he will do the same thing. And early on, his mother said to him, not everyone needs to see that. And so he will say that with great joy. Not everyone needs to see that. And some days he will call my wife just because he knows that she will say, no, don't do that. And of course, her feigning disgust with it just pours more fuel on his fire and more twinkling in his eyes and more joy in his face, more beaming on that countenance. I whomp my belly, we were made to whomp our bellies. We were made to live in the fierce joy of the God who loves us. That's for today. Whomp your belly today. Welcome home.
Hey, I'm Tim. Thanks for joining us here at Become New. We hope that these videos help you to grow spiritually one day at a time. If you want to access our whole library of videos, or if you want to subscribe to the daily emails or text messages that go along with each video, head on over to becomenew.com and you can let us know there. We're also preparing some exclusive leadership content. So if you're interested in that, you can let us know at becomenew.com/leadership. And lastly, if you've got a prayer request, we would love to pray for you. You can let us know by texting it to 855-888-0444. See you next time.